In narrow streets and crowded tenements, power was built through connections, planning, and discipline. While rival gangs fought over blocks and corners, one man studied routes, finances, and loyalties. He linked gambling rooms, bootlegging routes, union offices, and private meetings into one system. Deals were recorded, favors were tracked, and disputes were settled behind closed doors. Police gathered reports, reporters followed court hearings, and rivals watched for mistakes. Yet his organization continued to expand, operating through documents, schedules, and trusted intermediaries. This was the rise of a network that turned scattered crime into a coordinated enterprise. The world of organized crime is one defined by shadows and secrecy, where power is held not in broad daylight but in the hidden recesses of society, beneath the veneer of law and order. It is a world where the line between criminal and entrepreneur blurs, where ambition is the driving force, and where loyalty and betrayal are often just two sides of the same coin. In this world, few names resonate as strongly as that of Salvatore Lucky Luciano, a man whose rise from the streets of New York to the head of the most powerful criminal syndicate in America changed the course of organized crime forever. Born in 1897 in the heart of Manhattan, Luciano's story begins not in luxury but in the same rough, immigrant-dominated neighborhoods that would shape the identity of so many future Mafia members. The son of Sicilian immigrants, Luciano's early years were marked by the grinding poverty that defined the lives of countless families in the Lower East Side. Life in these cramped, overcrowded tenements was harsh, and survival often depended on the ability to navigate a world governed by street rules rather than those of the law. From a young age, Luciano learned that the world was a place where might made right, and that power could be gained by any means necessary. In this environment, the future Mafia boss was introduced to a world where crime was not merely an alternative to the legitimate path, it was often the only path available. Young Luciano, like many of his peers, found himself caught between two worlds: the immigrant community where old-world traditions and codes of conduct held sway, and the streetwise culture that demanded respect, loyalty, and the willingness to do whatever it took to rise to the top. It was a world in which every encounter, every transaction, was governed by unspoken rules that would come to define Luciano's life and his rise to power. As a teenager, Luciano quickly became involved in petty crime, stealing, gambling, and engaging in the kinds of activities that were as much a part of the fabric of New York's immigrant communities as the pushcarts and markets that line the streets. He formed connections with other young men who would go on to become key figures in the Mafia world. Names like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who would, in time, become some of his closest allies. It was in these early years that Luciano began to hone the skills that would make him a force to be reckoned with: an uncanny ability to read people, a knack for manipulating situations to his advantage, and an unrelenting drive to rise above the limitations imposed by his environment. Despite his early involvement in crime, Luciano did not immediately set out to become a Mafia boss. Like many of his peers, his ambitions were shaped by the harsh realities of his world, but his vision was always bigger. He recognized early on that to survive, let alone thrive in the underworld, he would need more than just muscle. He would need a strategy, a plan to organize, unify, and control the sprawling, disjointed world of New York's criminal syndicates. This vision would ultimately set him apart from his contemporaries, who were often focused on short-term gains rather than long-term control. By the time Luciano reached adulthood, the Mafia in America was a fragmented and chaotic system. Various Italian-American factions controlled different aspects of the criminal landscape, from gambling and bootlegging to labor unions and smuggling. These factions were often at war with one another, each vying for power, control, and dominance over the others. Luciano, however, was a man of a different kind. Rather than engaging in endless turf wars and infighting, he saw the potential for a more efficient, more powerful system. Luciano's genius was in his understanding of organization: how to turn chaos into order, how to unite disparate elements under a single banner. He recognized that the Mafia's disarray was a weakness, and he set about transforming it into a unified, powerful force. His approach to the Mafia was revolutionary. Whereas previous Mafia bosses had ruled through brute force and fear, Luciano understood the importance of structure and organization. He introduced a level of professionalism to the criminal enterprise that had never been seen before. He created a hierarchical system with bosses, underbosses, and capos, and set about negotiating with rival factions to bring them into his fold. By the time Luciano's plan was fully realized, the Mafia was no longer a collection of scattered, isolated gangs. It was a well-oiled machine, capable of dominating the criminal landscape across the entire country. Luciano's rise to power was not without its challenges. He faced opposition from some of the most powerful figures in organized crime, including Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two of the most powerful bosses in New York at the time. These men were determined to maintain their own control over the Mafia and were willing to go to great lengths to preserve their positions. The battle for control would culminate in what would later be known as the Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict between the factions of Masuria and Maranzano, which would ultimately pave the way for Luciano's ascent to the top. Luciano's strategy during this war was one of calculated patience and cold pragmatism. He did not rush into battle, nor did he seek to confront his enemies head-on. Instead, he bided his time, using diplomacy, manipulation, and cunning to weaken his rivals from within. He formed alliances with key figures who were dissatisfied with Masuria and Maranzano's leadership, offering them a chance to join his cause. By the time the war came to a head, Luciano had already positioned himself as the undisputed leader of the Mafia. Masuria and Maranzano, the two men who had once dominated the underworld, were dead, and Luciano was free to establish his own vision for the future of organized crime. As Luciano took control of the Mafia, he sought to transform it into a more modern, business-like enterprise. He introduced new methods of governance, organizing the Mafia along corporate lines. His innovations included the establishment of the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 Mafia families in New York, which would oversee all major decisions affecting the Mafia's operations. This system of governance was designed to prevent infighting and ensure that the Mafia operated more efficiently. It was a revolutionary move that would have lasting implications for the future of organized crime. In many ways, Luciano's rise was not just a triumph of personal ambition, it was a reflection of the changing times. The early 20th century was a period of great social and economic upheaval, and the Mafia, with its ruthlessness and adaptability, was well positioned to thrive in such an environment. Luciano's rise coincided with the Prohibition era, when the demand for illegal alcohol created vast new opportunities for organized crime. His ability to capitalize on this demand, along with his skill at negotiating and forging alliances, allowed him to amass unprecedented wealth and power. But for all his genius in building the Mafia into a powerful empire, Luciano was also a man shaped by the very system he had created. He was ruthless in his pursuit of power, and his ability to manipulate others and exploit their weaknesses became one of his defining traits. Yet, beneath the cold, calculating exterior, there was a man who understood the complexities of loyalty and betrayal, of trust and fear. Luciano's legacy, like that of many Mafia bosses, is one of contradictions. A man who, despite his criminal empire, understood the need for organization, structure, and even compassion in certain instances. He was a silent king, a figure who commanded respect not just through force, but through intellect, strategy, and the ability to adapt to the ever-changing tides of the criminal world. As the years passed and Luciano's power grew, his influence spread far beyond the streets of New York. He became a symbol of what the Mafia could achieve when its operations were streamlined and coordinated. But with power came danger. Rivals, the law, and internal betrayals all posed threats to Luciano's carefully constructed empire. His story, like the story of many great men before him, would ultimately be one of rise and fall. A cycle of power, betrayal, and redemption that would continue to shape the world of organized crime long after his death. Before Lucky Luciano's reign, the world of organized crime in America was chaotic, fragmented, and often dominated by petty rivalries and constant turf wars. The Mafia, while already a force in the American criminal landscape, lacked the unity, structure, and vision that would later come to define it under Luciano's leadership. Organized crime existed, but it was a collection of independent factions, each with its own rules, ambitions, and territories, operating more like a patchwork of isolated gangs rather than a cohesive, powerful entity. The underworld, in a sense, was an anarchic place, where brute force and individual power determined success, often at the cost of alliances and strategic thinking. It was a world where the term mafia was not yet synonymous with the massive, organized criminal syndicates that would later dominate global crime. The criminal factions that existed in New York during this period were often led by larger-than-life figures, each with their own brand of leadership. Names like Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, and the early Mafia dons of the 5 families were already well known in the underworld. These men held sway over various aspects of organized crime, bootlegging, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering, but their power was limited by constant infighting and the lack of a unified strategy. Instead of cooperation, there was competition. Instead of order, there was violence. The underworld was governed by personal vendettas, turf disputes, and the occasional truce brokered through force or negotiation. And while these men ruled large swaths of territory, they were constantly vulnerable to being toppled, undermined, or eliminated by rivals. Mafia and Maranzano, two of the most dominant figures in the early days of the Mafia, represented this fractured system of leadership. Their rivalry was legendary, and it encapsulated the chaotic, volatile nature of the pre-Luciano world. Mafia, often seen as the more traditional boss, ruled with an iron fist, using fear and intimidation to maintain control. Maranzano, on the other hand, was a more calculating figure, a man of ambition who sought to reshape the Mafia into a more structured organization, but his methods were just as ruthless as his rivals. Both men clashed over control of the Mafia, each seeking to establish dominance over New York's criminal empire. Their endless struggles for power, each one playing out with brutal force and cunning, were indicative of the disarray that characterized the Mafia at this time. In this environment, the Mafia's power was spread thin, each boss controlling their own territory, while gang warfare constantly threatened to undo any sense of order. The underworld was less a network and more a battlefield, where any opportunity for control was met with immediate conflict. The constant struggle for power among Mafia factions led to a dangerous and unpredictable environment where even the most established dons could fall from grace at any given moment. There were no overarching rules, no common cause that could unite these factions beyond their shared criminal interests. Loyalty was often contingent on temporary alliances and the sheer force of one's reputation. It was into this fragmented world that Luciano was born, and it is crucial to understand the environment in which he grew up in order to fully appreciate the scope of his transformation. The early 20th century in New York was a time of great social upheaval. The city was teeming with immigrants, many of them Italian, who brought with them their own cultural traditions and a distrust of the American system. Poverty was rampant, and crime became a way of life for many of these immigrants, a means of survival in a city that offered little opportunity. The Mafia, while not yet the powerhouse it would become, had already started to take root within these communities. Luciano's early life was shaped by the street violence, poverty, and corruption that permeated the neighborhoods of the Lower East Side and Brooklyn, and it was these conditions that made the criminal world seem like the only viable path for many young men like him. For Luciano, the streets of New York were his school, and the lessons he learned were ones of survival, cunning, and ruthless ambition. While other young men in his position might have fallen into the same petty crime syndicates and local gangs that dominated the underworld, Luciano saw an opportunity for something greater. The Mafia, in its disorganized, fragmented state, was a system ripe for change. While the older bosses clung to traditional methods of governance, ruled by fear, violence, and a strict code of honor, Luciano recognized that the future of crime lay in organizing the chaos into something more efficient, something more powerful. As Luciano began to make his mark, the tensions between the old guard and the new wave of organized crime leaders were beginning to reach a breaking point. The Mafia was in desperate need of reform, and the status quo of individual bosses fighting for control could no longer sustain the growing demand for illegal goods and services. With prohibition providing a massive opportunity for illicit enterprise, the criminal underworld was on the verge of expansion, but it needed someone with a grand vision to harness its potential. Luciano, despite being a relatively young player at the time, was already thinking ahead. He understood that if he could unite the Mafia's factions under one umbrella, he could create an empire that was not just more powerful but more enduring. The old way of doing things, dominated by one boss over each small territory, was outdated. A new structure was needed, one that would allow the Mafia to operate more like a business than a collection of scattered criminal operations. The chaos that preceded Luciano was not just a matter of gang wars and turf struggles, it was a world where no single figure could maintain control for long. The constant shifting of power, the betrayals, the backstabbing, the desperate attempts to seize control of whatever territory was available, it all played a part in creating the perfect storm for someone like Luciano to rise to the top. His ability to see the bigger picture, to recognize the flaws in the system and envision a more organized structure, set him apart from the men who came before him. While they fought for dominance in the streets, Luciano was thinking of a future where crime could be controlled with the precision of a corporation rather than the chaos of street warfare. In the years leading up to Luciano's ascent, New York's criminal syndicates were defined by a culture of intense rivalries and ever-shifting alliances. Mafia bosses were often more concerned with their immediate gains than with the long-term survival of the organization as a whole. This mentality bred a culture of instability, where no one could rest easy for fear of being betrayed or eliminated. Luciano, on the other hand, understood that real power lay not in fleeting victories but in sustainable dominance. He recognized that to build a true criminal empire, he needed to establish lasting relationships, create a more efficient system, and consolidate power into one central figurehead. The early years of Luciano's career were marked by the same kind of scrappy, street-level tactics that defined the world around him. However, his vision of a unified mafia began to take shape as he developed a reputation not just for his cunning and ruthlessness but for his ability to broker peace between warring factions. Unlike the more traditional bosses who ruled through sheer force, Luciano's influence was grounded in his ability to bring people together, often turning enemies into allies when it suited his purposes. He was not simply a criminal mastermind, he was a strategist, a man capable of seeing the big picture and bending the criminal world to his will. Luciano's ability to unite the fragmented underworld of New York was no small feat, and it was this capacity for strategic thinking that would allow him to build the most formidable crime empire in the history of organized crime. Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano's early years were marked by an environment as unforgiving as it was formative, and the lessons he learned in his youth would go on to shape not only his criminal ambitions but the very future of organized crime in America. Born in 1897, Luciano's life began in a New York City teeming with immigrant communities, where poverty was a daily reality and survival often meant adapting to a ruthless world. The Lower East Side, where Luciano spent his early years, was a cauldron of crime, vice, and aspiration, a place where the struggle for success took many forms, but all roads seemed to lead through the same dark alleys of the city. In a way, it was a place where the very fabric of the American dream collided with harsh realities, giving birth to a different kind of ambition. Luciano's family, like so many others in the immigrant waves of the early 20th century, struggled to make a living. His father, a Sicilian immigrant, was a poor man, working odd jobs to make ends meet, while his mother, also from Sicily, had to manage the household with little to support her. The Lucianos, like countless other families in the same situation, lived in tenements, small, overcrowded apartments where the ceilings seemed to close in on them. Poverty was the family's constant companion, and it was in this environment that Luciano first learned about the ways of the world, the rules of the street, the hard lessons that would later guide him toward power. In many ways, Luciano's formative years were defined by a constant sense of displacement. As the son of immigrants, he was caught between two cultures, that of his Italian heritage and the American society that offered little in the way of opportunity for families like his. This duality created a tension within him that would persist throughout his life. On the one hand, he was part of a community of Italian Americans who were tightly bound by their shared heritage, history, and values. On the other hand, Luciano also recognized that his family's position in American society was tenuous at best. Immigrants were often treated with suspicion, disdain, and prejudice. To survive, Luciano would need to forge his own path, one that didn't rely on the flimsy promises of the American dream but rather on the power he could acquire through the street's own brutal code. By the time Luciano was a teenager, he had already witnessed the raw power of the streets. The tenements were full of men who had made their way in the world through crime, and Luciano quickly became acquainted with these figures. Small-time crooks, streetwise gamblers, and hustlers who saw no other way to rise than by bending the rules. This was where Luciano first encountered the power dynamics of the criminal underworld, and it didn't take long for him to recognize that in this world, power was often more important than money or status. People respected the ability to command fear, loyalty, and trust, qualities that he would soon learn to exploit for his own purposes. Luciano was no stranger to petty crime. Like many other boys growing up in the same conditions, he began by participating in small-time thefts, hustles, and scams. But even as a young man, he exhibited an uncanny ability to read situations, a trait that would later serve him in his rise to power. Luciano understood that the streets were governed not just by violence, but by the psychological forces of manipulation and perception. He learned to operate in the gray areas, where fear and loyalty overlapped, where trust could be just as important as a weapon. As he gained more experience, Luciano also began to build relationships with more established figures in the criminal world, gradually integrating himself into the networks of influence that ran beneath the surface of New York's immigrant neighborhoods. His early years in crime also taught him the value of discretion. Luciano wasn't the kind of person to make a name for himself through flamboyant displays of violence or bravado. Instead, he worked quietly in the background, learning how things worked and what levers needed to be pulled to get ahead. He understood that true power wasn't in the loudest fight, but in the most effective control, getting people to do what you wanted without them even realizing they were doing it. This ability to remain under the radar while steadily gaining influence would become a hallmark of his character throughout his career. However, it was not just Luciano's street smarts that would propel him forward, it was his vision for something bigger. Even in his early teens, he began to see that the fractured, disorganized world of New York's criminal underworld was a world ripe for consolidation. While the Mafia had existed for decades, it had always been splintered into numerous factions, each fighting for control of their own piece of the pie. Luciano recognized the weakness in this system: the infighting, the turf wars, the lack of coordination. To Luciano, the chaos of the Mafia was its greatest flaw, but it also presented an opportunity. The fractured nature of organized crime meant that there was no true power center. Instead, it was a loose collection of gangsters, each doing his own thing, often in conflict with others. What Luciano saw, and what set him apart from his contemporaries, was the potential to bring order to this chaos. He understood that the future of the Mafia lay not in individual bosses fighting for control over isolated pockets of power, but in creating a centralized, organized network that could operate like a business, with a structure, hierarchy, and clear lines of communication. Instead of constant violence and upheaval, Luciano envisioned a world where the Mafia could act in a more systematic, strategic way, with power shared across a broader network of loyal figures. This was the birth of what would later become the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 major Mafia families in New York, with Luciano himself at the center. As Luciano moved into his late teens and early 20s, he became more involved in the larger, more established criminal organizations. He worked his way up through the ranks of various street gangs, gradually earning the trust of powerful figures like the infamous mobster Arnold Rothstein, a gambler and racketeer who would later become one of Luciano's key mentors. Rothstein's influence was crucial in Luciano's development, as he learned the intricacies of running large-scale criminal operations, from gambling and extortion to smuggling and bootlegging. Rothstein, a calculating figure who valued brains over brawn, recognized Luciano's potential early on and took him under his wing. Luciano's ability to adapt quickly to the realities of organized crime allowed him to rise in stature within these circles. He was not just a capable soldier in the criminal world, he was a thinker, a planner, and an innovator. Unlike many of his peers who were content with simply running their small fiefdoms, Luciano was always looking for a way to expand, to consolidate power, and to increase his influence. His natural talents for leadership, combined with his growing network of allies, made him an emerging force within the Mafia. It was during this period that Luciano also began to forge relationships with other future key players in the world of organized crime. Figures like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello would become his closest allies and confidants, and together, they would help Luciano lay the foundation for the modern Mafia. But even as Luciano began to gain allies and rise in power, he was careful not to alienate those who had the potential to be useful to him in the future. He understood that the Mafia was a world where loyalty was paramount, but where survival often depended on knowing when to keep friends close, and when to keep enemies closer. In these early years, Luciano's rise was defined by quiet ambition. He worked his way through the ranks with purpose, never rushing to claim the title of boss but always keeping his eyes on the bigger picture. Luciano was patient, methodical, and strategic. He understood that true power didn't come overnight. It came from careful planning, forging the right alliances, and learning how to manipulate the forces around you to serve your own ends. This was the foundation of Luciano's future success. His ability to operate within the confines of the criminal world while simultaneously working to reshape it according to his own vision. While his peers were content with smaller wins, Luciano was already thinking on a grander scale. His early years were not just about earning money or gaining power, they were about building something larger than himself. And as the years went on, Luciano's vision would start to take shape, transforming the fragmented, chaotic world of the Mafia into the powerful, organized empire he had always dreamed of. Luciano's path to power was not one of simple accumulation of wealth or control over territory, it was about revolutionizing the structure of the Mafia itself. While others before him, like the powerful bosses Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, ruled through force, fear, and territorial control, Luciano recognized that true power lay in organization and unity. By the time he began to establish himself as a key figure in New York's underworld, he had already started to visualize a new kind of Mafia, one that was more akin to a well-oiled business than the chaotic, disjointed collection of street gangs that dominated the crime scene at the time. Luciano's vision was both ambitious and pragmatic. He understood that the fragmented nature of the Mafia, dominated by various independent factions, each led by a different boss, was a weakness. The constant turf wars, the infighting, and the lack of cohesion between the various criminal organizations meant that the Mafia could never reach its full potential. In the early years, organized crime was ruled by a handful of powerful figures, but their grip on the underworld was never secure. They were perpetually at odds with each other, vying for control of territory, and often undermining one another in the process. In this volatile environment, no single boss could maintain absolute control for long. Luciano saw this as an opportunity, a gap in the structure that he could exploit to establish dominance. What set Luciano apart from other mafia bosses was his ability to think beyond the immediate competition. Rather than engaging in endless battles for control over turf, Luciano sought to unite the various factions and bring them under one unified banner. He knew that to achieve this he would need not just force but strategy. Luciano was a master of alliances, and he understood that the mafia could only become truly powerful if it operated like a business, with clear roles, responsibilities, and leadership. His plan was to consolidate the various factions, organize them into a network that would work together for mutual benefit, and establish himself as the supreme leader of this new order. Luciano's first major step toward this transformation was the creation of the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 mafia families in New York City. This was a groundbreaking concept. Rather than having individual bosses constantly at war with each other, Luciano proposed that they come together and govern as a collective. The commission would act as a kind of board of directors, with each boss having an equal say in the decisions that affected the mafia as a whole. The idea was to eliminate the constant infighting and bloodshed that had defined the mafia up until that point. The commission would have the authority to settle disputes, allocate territories, and ensure that the mafia's operations ran smoothly. At the heart of Luciano's plan was the recognition that power had to be distributed and managed in a way that ensured stability. By creating the commission, Luciano effectively established a system of checks and balances within the mafia, something that had never existed before. This move also allowed him to maintain his control without having to resort to the kind of violent showdowns that had previously defined the rise to power in the mafia. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to create a system where power was shared but also centralized. He did not need to fight every battle himself. He simply needed to ensure that the right people were in place to fight them for him. Another key element of Luciano's empire-building strategy was his approach to organized crime as a business. While other mafia leaders may have viewed their operations as a means of exerting personal power, Luciano saw the potential for wealth and influence on an entirely different scale. He was a visionary who recognized that crime could be turned into a profitable and efficient industry, one that could operate just like any other legitimate business. Under Luciano's leadership, the mafia would not just engage in petty theft or small-time gambling, it would control vast networks of smuggling, labor racketeering, and bootlegging, all of which could generate enormous profits. Luciano's ability to make the mafia a business was also a testament to his understanding of the times in which he lived. The 1920s and 1930s were marked by prohibition, a time when alcohol was illegal, and demand for bootlegged liquor was at an all-time high. Luciano saw this as a golden opportunity to build a criminal empire. Whereas other mobsters focused on street-level activities, Luciano moved swiftly to control the bootlegging trade, using his connections and organizational skills to streamline the operation and maximize profits. He understood that in order to make his criminal empire last, he needed to not just rely on violent tactics but on infrastructure and logistics. He built an intricate network for smuggling alcohol across state lines, which made the mafia an indispensable part of the illegal economy. One of Luciano's most important allies in this venture was Meyer Lansky, a brilliant financier who shared Luciano's vision of transforming organized crime into a more efficient, business-like operation. Lansky was instrumental in helping Luciano establish the financial infrastructure that allowed the mafia to grow on such a massive scale. With Lansky's help, Luciano was able to funnel money from illegal operations into legitimate businesses, creating a money laundering system that further protected the mafia's wealth and influence. This partnership between the two men was one of the key factors that allowed Luciano's empire to thrive, as it combined street-level power with sophisticated financial strategies. Luciano's ability to organize the mafia also extended beyond the realm of bootlegging. He understood that crime, like any other business, required diversification. He made moves to expand the mafia's reach into other areas, including gambling, unions, and labor racketeering. These ventures not only generated additional revenue streams but also gave the mafia a foothold in industries that were essential to the functioning of American society. By controlling labor unions, for example, Luciano could ensure that the mafia had influence over key industries like construction, transportation, and shipping. The unions provided a steady stream of income, as well as opportunities for further expansion, as they were often linked to the mafia's other operations. Luciano also recognized the importance of maintaining control over the mafia's public image. While other mobsters were content to operate in the shadows, Luciano worked hard to cultivate relationships with influential figures in both the political and business worlds. He understood that in order for the Mafia to operate smoothly, it needed the protection and cooperation of those in power. Luciano was skilled at forging alliances with corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and businessmen who were willing to turn a blind eye to his operations in exchange for a share of the profits. This network of political connections gave Luciano the kind of immunity from law enforcement that allowed his empire to flourish in ways that had never been seen before. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia became an extraordinarily well-organized and profitable enterprise. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to think long-term, and to build alliances with key figures allowed him to expand his influence across the United States. While others were content with operating in their own territories, Luciano's vision was global. He began to set his sights on international operations, including the smuggling of narcotics and the expansion of the Mafia's reach into Latin America and Europe. Luciano's genius lay in his understanding that the Mafia's potential was not limited to the streets of New York. It could be a global enterprise with far-reaching power and influence. The changes Luciano made to the Mafia were not just structural, they were cultural as well. He instituted a code of conduct that demanded loyalty, discipline, and efficiency. Under his leadership, the Mafia was no longer just a collection of criminals, it became an organization, a business, and a power structure. The Mafia was no longer just about street-level violence and petty theft, it was a sophisticated, multinational criminal enterprise with a clear hierarchy, a system of governance, and a plan for the future. Luciano's ability to bring order to the chaos of the Mafia marked the beginning of a new era, one in which organized crime was no longer just a part of the underworld, it was a force that could not be ignored. The Code of Silence, or Omerta, was the moral and psychological backbone of the Mafia. It was not just a rule but a fundamental aspect of its identity, a way of life that governed every relationship within the criminal world. Luciano, with his keen understanding of power dynamics, not only respected this code but used it as a tool to consolidate control and manipulate the Mafia's inner workings. Omerta was the silent agreement that bound the Mafia together, creating a system where loyalty, fear, and silence were the most powerful currencies. It was a code that demanded complete allegiance to the family and a strict refusal to cooperate with law enforcement or outsiders, even in the face of arrest, betrayal, or death. The success of the Mafia, as Luciano understood it, depended on this ironclad rule that united all members under a shared purpose of survival, secrecy, and unshakable loyalty. From a psychological perspective, Omerta served as both a shield and a sword. On the one hand, it protected the Mafia from the reach of the law. The idea that no one would speak out against the organization regardless of the personal consequences, was what allowed the Mafia to operate with impunity year after year. Without Omerta, the system of organized crime that Luciano envisioned could never have existed. No criminal empire could survive without a strict code that dictated how to handle betrayal or cooperation with authorities. In the Mafia, a rat was the most dishonorable of figures. A person who would betray the family for personal gain or worse, expose the organization to law enforcement. Punishment for breaking Omerta was swift, brutal, and often fatal. This extreme penalty created a culture of fear that kept most members loyal to the cause. However, Omerta was also a tool of control. Luciano, with his deep understanding of human nature, recognized that people are not easily controlled by mere violence alone. Loyalty needed to be earned and reinforced, and Omerta provided the psychological framework to do this. The threat of betrayal was ever present in the Mafia, and yet the silence demanded by Omerta created a form of psychological unity within the family. Even in the face of overwhelming pressure from law enforcement or rival families, the Mafia remained resilient because its members understood the deep consequences of speaking out or betraying the group. Silence, therefore, became a form of collective power. It was a psychological contract that bound individuals to the group and provided a sense of purpose beyond personal survival. Luciano, while firm in his commitment to Omerta, also understood the pragmatic need to adapt this code to the changing realities of organized crime. The Mafia could no longer exist in the shadows without evolving to meet the needs of a modernizing society. The laws, the politics, and the social dynamics were shifting, and the underworld had to find a way to operate within these constraints while maintaining its code. For Luciano, Omerta was not simply a tool of intimidation but a vehicle for efficiency. Silence among the ranks allowed him to focus on building the Mafia's empire without the distractions of internal dissonance. Every member's commitment to this code of silence was essential for the smooth operation of the enterprise. Luciano saw that for his empire to thrive, it needed not only loyal soldiers but loyal families, businessmen, and political figures who would remain silent in the face of government scrutiny. At its core, Omerta was about survival. Those who adhered to the code were rewarded with protection, influence, and wealth, promises that the Mafia could always deliver as long as they remained loyal to the family. In many ways, Omerta became the psychological glue that held the Mafia together through decades of law enforcement crackdowns, political challenges, and rivalries. By the time Luciano took control of the Mafia, the code had already been deeply ingrained in the organization, but it was Luciano's manipulation and enforcement of it that would elevate the Mafia to new heights of power and sophistication. He didn't just use Omerta as a deterrent for betrayal, he turned it into a tool for institutionalizing loyalty. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to navigate and adapt the rules of the Mafia without ever openly questioning or discarding them. The code of silence was sacred, and any attempt to undermine it would have disastrous consequences. Yet, Luciano understood that silence did not always mean obedience. He knew that beneath the surface of the Mafia's strict hierarchy, there were always forces of ambition and discontent. While the code created an atmosphere of fear and respect, it also allowed for subtle manipulations and power plays. The silent war for power within the Mafia was often just as dangerous as the loud battles between rival families. Luciano maintained control not through brute force but through his ability to anticipate and manage these silent struggles, ensuring that every move within the Mafia was calculated and deliberate. Omerta's influence extended far beyond the inner workings of the Mafia. It shaped how Luciano interacted with the outside world, particularly with law enforcement and politicians. The code of silence effectively neutralized the threat of government interference. By maintaining absolute loyalty within the family and ensuring that no one spoke to the authorities, Luciano was able to keep the law at bay for years. Police could arrest members of the Mafia, but without the cooperation of the Mafia itself, there was little they could do to dismantle the organization. The Mafia's ability to operate without being betrayed from within was a key factor in its continued survival and expansion. And yet, Luciano also understood that the code of silence had to be enforced with both fear and respect. Members of the Mafia were well aware of the consequences of violating Omerta, but they also knew that maintaining the code was their only path to survival. Yet, Luciano's enforcement of Omerta was not always as simple as punishing those who betrayed it. He had a profound understanding of the human psyche and knew that loyalty could be maintained not just through fear but through rewards. Members of the Mafia who adhered to the code and performed their duties were often generously rewarded, sometimes with wealth, sometimes with power, sometimes with the respect of their peers. In this way, Omerta became a dual system of both punishment and reward. While betrayal led to swift retribution, loyalty was often repaid with lucrative positions and opportunities to expand one's influence. Luciano's ability to create an environment where loyalty was both a moral obligation and a strategic asset made him one of the most successful and powerful mob bosses in history. Another important aspect of the Code of Silence was its role in maintaining the unity of the Mafia, even in the face of extreme pressure. During times of war between rival families, during police crackdowns, or when betrayal seemed imminent, Omerta kept the organization focused on the goal of survival. It was not just a code of silence, it was a psychological contract that bound the individual to the collective, ensuring that every member of the Mafia prioritized the family's interests over their own. This shared loyalty created a sense of community and solidarity, even in the most perilous situations. Omerta was, in essence, the glue that held the entire structure together, and its strength was a testament to the enduring power of the Mafia under Luciano's leadership. Omerta was, in many ways, the embodiment of Luciano's strategic genius. He didn't just rely on violence or fear to maintain control, he used the code to create a psychological environment where loyalty was not just expected but required. By doing so, he transformed the Mafia from a chaotic, fragmented collection of criminal factions into a highly organized, efficient, and virtually indestructible force. The psychological impact of Omerta on those within the Mafia was profound, as it created a deep sense of belonging and a shared commitment to the survival of the organization. It was this psychological unity, more than any individual act of violence or intimidation, that enabled Luciano to build the most powerful and enduring criminal empire in American history. The Code of Silence was not just a tool for survival, it was a foundation upon which the entire structure of Luciano's Mafia was built. Luciano's transition from street-level hustler to the architect of a criminal empire was shaped not just by his personal ambition but by his revolutionary approach to turning crime into a highly efficient, profitable business. The Mafia, in its fragmented form, had always operated on a patchwork of illegal operations: smuggling, extortion, gambling, and bootlegging, but these enterprises were often inefficient, chaotic, and vulnerable to external forces. Luciano recognized that the key to dominating the criminal world lay in transforming these disjointed operations into a cohesive, well-managed enterprise. His genius was in understanding that organized crime could no longer be a loose network of independent, warring factions but needed to function like a legitimate business, complete with structure, strategy, and long-term goals. Luciano didn't just want to run the Mafia. He wanted to build a system that could thrive in a modern, increasingly complex world. One of the most pivotal areas in Luciano's transformation of the Mafia was in gambling. While illegal betting and the operation of illicit casinos were long-standing traditions within organized crime, they had, until Luciano's rise, been largely disorganized. Many smaller crime syndicates ran their own gambling operations, each with their own methods and without much coordination. Luciano saw the enormous potential in gambling, both as a source of immense profit and as a means of gaining influence, and he sought to standardize and control the business from top to bottom. By consolidating the various gambling operations and bringing them under one central authority, he was able to create a monopoly that could generate immense revenue, avoid the inefficiencies of fragmented operations, and maintain control over a key part of the Mafia's revenue stream. This wasn't just about gambling as a means to make money, it was about ensuring that the operation was secure, that the money flowed in an organized and predictable manner, and that it could withstand the pressures from law enforcement and rival factions. Luciano's system made sure that the numbers games, illegal casinos, and other gambling enterprises weren't simply chaotic ventures. They were part of an integrated, profitable machine that could generate huge returns for the Mafia while keeping it shielded from interference. He ensured that local bosses and operators followed a set of rules and paid their cut to the higher-ups in the family, effectively making the whole business more systematic and more profitable. The second pillar of Luciano's reorganization of crime was bootlegging. Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, had created a perfect storm for organized crime. Alcohol was in high demand, and the government's attempt to ban it led to widespread smuggling and illegal production. Before Luciano's rise, bootlegging was primarily run by individual gangs and mobsters, with each faction trying to smuggle alcohol into the United States by its own means, often competing against each other. Luciano saw the inefficiency in this, and the potential for even greater profits, if he could unite these various factions under one central control. By streamlining the smuggling process, creating distribution channels, and coordinating production, he was able to turn bootlegging into an incredibly lucrative, organized business. It wasn't just about getting alcohol into the country, it was about controlling every aspect of the operation, from production to distribution, ensuring that the Mafia could monopolize the market and keep the profits flowing smoothly. Luciano also innovated in his approach to labor racketeering. In the early 20th century, labor unions were a powerful force, controlling industries like construction, transportation, and manufacturing. Luciano recognized the potential of these unions to generate income, but more importantly, he saw the leverage they could provide over major industries. By infiltrating labor unions, Luciano could control a vast swath of the American economy. Through a combination of bribery, coercion, and manipulation, he placed Mafia members in key positions within union leadership. This allowed him to take a cut of the workers' wages, control union strikes, and exert influence over the city's infrastructure. The Mafia's grip on unions became so tight that they were able to dictate terms to businesses, making it nearly impossible for companies to operate without giving in to the demands of organized crime. Labor racketeering was not just about extorting money from businesses, it was also about controlling the flow of goods and services in American cities. With Mafia-controlled unions, Luciano could ensure that workers went on strike when it suited him, that construction projects were delayed or expedited based on his needs, and that certain industries were forced to pay for the privilege of operating. This level of control not only bolstered Luciano's empire but allowed him to maintain influence in critical sectors of the economy, which was essential to his long-term strategy. Through labor racketeering, Luciano cemented his position not only as a powerful mob boss but as a force to be reckoned with in the larger business world. While gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering were the major revenue sources for Luciano's Mafia, he also understood the importance of diversifying his criminal portfolio. One of his key strategies was to move into more complex and profitable illegal activities, including narcotics trafficking and the smuggling of precious metals. These operations, while dangerous and high risk, provided a massive return on investment, and Luciano was not one to shy away from high-stakes ventures. His ability to manage and profit from such risky operations demonstrated his versatility as a criminal mastermind, and it also highlighted his willingness to adapt to the changing times. Narcotics, in particular, was a market that became increasingly lucrative during the 1930s and 1940s, and Luciano's foresight allowed him to position the Mafia as a major player in the drug trade before it became the global industry it is today. Despite the massive wealth and influence Luciano amassed through these ventures, he never lost sight of the importance of maintaining control over the Mafia's operations. He understood that for his empire to succeed, the various enterprises needed to be managed not just by muscle but by minds. This is where Luciano's relationships with figures like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello became crucial. Lansky, in particular, was a brilliant strategist and financier, and his partnership with Luciano allowed the Mafia to shift from being a collection of petty criminals to a far-reaching, highly organized criminal business. Lansky's expertise in managing finances and laundering money allowed Luciano to reinvest his profits in legitimate businesses, providing a front that shielded the Mafia's wealth and kept it safe from law enforcement scrutiny. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia wasn't just a criminal network, it was an enterprise that spanned entire industries, governed entire cities, and employed thousands of people. It operated much like a corporation with different branches of the family responsible for different areas of the business. Some bosses managed the operations in specific neighborhoods, while others controlled the smuggling routes, the casinos, or the unions. Luciano himself kept a tight grip on the overall strategy, always making sure that everyone worked in concert to ensure the success of the entire operation. He knew that a disjointed Mafia would not last, so he built a system that prioritized cooperation over conflict, efficiency over brute force, and long-term profit over short-term victories. This business model allowed Luciano's Mafia to survive, thrive, and expand during a period when many criminal organizations were either collapsing or being dismantled by law enforcement. By treating crime like business, Luciano ensured that his empire could withstand the challenges that came with being one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. His ability to manage these diverse operations, keep the peace within the family, and maintain his position as the head of the organization made him the most successful and enduring Mafia boss in American history. Under Luciano, the Mafia was no longer just a collection of street thugs, it was a criminal empire, running like a well-oiled machine with Luciano as the mastermind at its helm. His transformation of organized crime would have a profound impact on the future of the Mafia and set the stage for the expansion of organized crime around the world. The rise of Luciano was as much about his alliances as it was about his own cunning. He understood that power in the Mafia wasn't just about individual strength, it was about building a network of loyalty, trust, and mutual benefit. For Luciano, the Mafia was never just a family in the traditional sense. It was a complex web of relationships, each built on the understanding that loyalty had to be both earned and reciprocated. This wasn't simply about shaking down rivals or fighting for territory, it was about creating a system of alliances that could ensure both stability and growth in an otherwise volatile environment. Early in his rise, Luciano made sure to establish connections with a select group of individuals who would become the cornerstones of his empire. These men were not just powerful in their own right, they were also visionaries who saw the potential of Luciano's model of organized crime. The first among these was Meyer Lansky, a man who would become one of Luciano's closest allies and trusted confidants. Lansky was a brilliant financier, a genius when it came to money laundering, and a man who understood the long-term implications of organized crime on both a financial and political level. Their partnership would prove to be a pivotal one, combining Luciano's street-smart savvy and Lansky's financial expertise to create one of the most enduring criminal empires in American history. But it wasn't just Lansky who played a key role in Luciano's rise, it was also men like Frank Costello and Bugsy Siegel. Costello, with his political connections, was instrumental in helping Luciano navigate the increasingly complex world of law enforcement, while Siegel, known for his ruthlessness and bold vision, provided the muscle and street credibility that was needed to back up the new model of the Mafia. Each of these men brought something unique to the table, and Luciano knew how to leverage their strengths without alienating them. The ability to foster such powerful alliances was a testament to Luciano's intelligence and vision. It was through these alliances that Luciano was able to establish his dominance over New York's criminal underworld. As tensions between the various families grew, Luciano's strategy was to keep his rivals close while ensuring that they remained dependent on him for their survival. The power struggles between the older Mafia families, primarily the factions led by Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, created an opening for Luciano and he capitalized on it. By the time the so-called Castellammarese War erupted between the two factions in the early 1930s, Luciano had positioned himself as the kingmaker, aligning himself with the forces that would eventually bring down both Masuria and Maranzano. Luciano's involvement in the war was a turning point, not just in his own career but in the history of the Mafia itself. His decision to betray Masuria, once a mentor and close ally, was a pivotal moment in his ascent to power. Masuria, who had been one of the most influential Mafia bosses in New York, was becoming increasingly erratic and power-hungry, refusing to see the benefit of uniting the Mafia under one central authority. His insistence on using brute force rather than strategic alliances alienated many in the Mafia, and Luciano, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity to replace him with someone who was more open to collaboration and efficiency. The eventual murder of Masuria, orchestrated by Luciano's men, was one of the most dramatic and defining moments of the Castellammarese War. Masuria's death marked the end of an era, one where individual bosses fought for dominance, and the beginning of Luciano's vision for a more structured, business-like mafia. His victory over Masuria solidified his place as the dominant figure in New York's underworld, but it also demonstrated his ability to make hard decisions, to take risks, and to put his ambitions above personal loyalty. Luciano's willingness to betray his former mentor was not something that could be easily forgiven, and it showcased the brutal nature of the Mafia's world, a world where alliances were always conditional and loyalty could be fleeting. But Luciano's coup wasn't complete without the elimination of Salvatore Maranzano, Masuria's rival and the other major player in the war. After Masuria's death, Maranzano assumed leadership of the Castellammarese faction, but he, too, proved to be an obstacle to Luciano's vision. Maranzano, like Masuria, believed in the old ways of the Mafia: territorial control, constant violence, and a focus on personal power. Luciano, in contrast, was building a new kind of Mafia, one that was less about brute force and more about unity, structure, and long-term strategy. Maranzano, too, would meet his end at the hands of Luciano's men in 1931. His murder was not just a victory for Luciano but a defining moment in the transformation of the Mafia. With Maranzano's death, Luciano eliminated the last of the old guard and assumed control over the New York Mafia. But rather than simply taking over as the head of one family, he orchestrated the creation of the Commission, an unprecedented move that would reshape the way organized crime was governed in the United States. The Commission was not just a strategic move, it was a brilliant piece of political maneuvering. By establishing the Commission, Luciano created a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 major Mafia families in New York. The Commission would have the authority to make decisions, resolve disputes, and allocate resources in a way that would ensure stability and prevent further bloodshed. Luciano's creation of the Commission was, in many ways, the final step in his vision of a Mafia that operated like a corporation, with clear lines of authority, accountability, and communication. But while Luciano was busy consolidating power and building alliances within the Mafia, he also had to contend with the ever-present threat of law enforcement. In the early years of his reign, Luciano faced intense pressure from both local and federal authorities. His growing power and influence in the underworld had not gone unnoticed, and many in law enforcement saw him as a threat to the stability of New York City. Luciano's ability to maintain his position despite this constant threat speaks to his strategic genius. He knew how to maintain a low profile, how to keep his operations running smoothly without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Unlike other mobsters who operated with reckless abandon, Luciano was calculated, deliberate, and always kept his true ambitions hidden beneath the surface. One of the key components of Luciano's strategy was his relationship with politicians and law enforcement officials. He understood that in order to operate freely, he needed to ensure that those in power were either on his side or willing to turn a blind eye to his activities. Luciano's ability to navigate the complex world of politics was another factor that set him apart from his rivals. He worked tirelessly to build relationships with influential political figures, often using bribery, favors, or manipulation to ensure that his business interests were protected. Luciano's connections with politicians and police officers were crucial to the survival of his empire. In a time when law enforcement was beginning to ramp up its efforts to crack down on organized crime, these relationships helped to shield Luciano from the full force of the law. His ability to call in favors and use political connections to avoid prosecution was one of the main reasons his criminal enterprise was able to flourish for so long. These alliances with key figures in both law enforcement and politics were a testament to Luciano's understanding of the world he operated in. He knew that true power came from not just controlling the streets but controlling the systems that govern them. However, Luciano's rise was not without its enemies. Rival mobsters, particularly those who had lost out in the war for dominance, were always a threat. And within the Mafia itself, there were many who resented his rapid ascent, viewing him as an outsider who had bypassed the old ways of earning respect. The tension between the old guard and Luciano's new vision would continue to simmer throughout his reign, but Luciano's ability to neutralize threats, both internal and external, made him virtually untouchable for years. His alliances, forged through mutual benefit and strategic necessity, allowed him to rise above the petty rivalries that plagued the Mafia. Through his deft handling of allies and enemies alike, Luciano was able to solidify his control over New York and, by extension, much of the Mafia in America. His alliances, strategic, calculated, and at times ruthless, were the key to his success. But it was his vision for the future of organized crime that set him apart from all the mob bosses who had come before him. He saw the Mafia not just as a series of isolated families but as a network of interconnected businesses, a force that could operate on a global scale. And as he expanded his influence and solidified his alliances, he laid the groundwork for the modern Mafia, an empire that would outlast even its most ambitious leaders. The years following Luciano's consolidation of power were marked by a delicate balance of survival, political maneuvering, and brutal enforcement. While he had successfully neutralized his enemies within the Mafia and had established an unprecedented system of governance through the Commission, he still faced external threats from both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. The hidden war within the Mafia was not just about turf. It was about maintaining control over a complex web of interests that stretched from New York streets to the political corridors of Washington. Every move Luciano made was calculated, not just to ensure his dominance in the underworld but to protect the longevity of his empire. The first major challenge Luciano faced was the increasingly aggressive stance of law enforcement. The 1930s and 1940s were a time of great social and political upheaval in the United States. The Great Depression had caused widespread economic instability, and the government, desperate to restore order and curb the rising tide of organized crime, began to ramp up its efforts to dismantle the Mafia. The federal government, in particular, was keen on going after mobsters like Luciano, who represented the very heart of the criminal syndicate in America. The FBI, led by a young and ambitious J. Edgar Hoover, was beginning to focus its efforts on organized crime, and Luciano's name was at the top of their list. Luciano had always been cautious and strategic, and he knew that his criminal empire could not survive in the face of mounting law enforcement pressure unless he adapted. The situation became even more complicated when the U.S. government began to investigate organized crime on a larger scale. In 1936, the U.S. Senate established the famous Mafia hearings, which were designed to expose the growing influence of organized crime in American society. This public scrutiny was a direct threat to Luciano's empire. He understood that, in a time of heightened political attention, any misstep could bring down everything he had worked for. At the same time, Luciano was beginning to sense a shift in the political landscape. During this period he had made significant alliances with influential political figures, but the volatile nature of American politics meant that those relationships could quickly turn sour. Luciano knew that in order to survive, he had to outsmart both the political and criminal forces that sought to undermine him. The Mafia had long operated in the shadows, but as it became a more formidable force in American society, it drew increasing attention, both from politicians looking to use it as a scapegoat and law enforcement agencies hoping to destroy it. In the face of these external threats, Luciano relied on his ability to operate with complete discretion, maintaining a low profile whenever necessary and making sure that his operations remained under the radar. Unlike some of his predecessors who thrived on excessive violence and blatant displays of power, Luciano understood that the key to longevity was subtlety. He had learned from the mistakes of others in the Mafia, observing how a lack of discretion and a thirst for public glory could lead to a rapid downfall. He knew that power lay not in the flash of violence but in the quiet manipulation of people and systems. Despite Luciano's careful strategies, his luck eventually ran out. In 1936, the authorities were able to land a major blow against him when they charged him with compulsory prostitution, a crime that carried serious penalties. Luciano's arrest in 1936 was a pivotal moment in the history of the Mafia, as it signaled the beginning of a new chapter in his life and the downfall of his unchallenged reign in New York's underworld. The arrest was a result of a lengthy investigation, which involved the efforts of several law enforcement agencies working together to gather evidence and build a case against Luciano. The legal proceedings were long and complex, and despite Luciano's resources and connections, he was ultimately convicted. His conviction, however, was just the beginning of his troubles. Luciano's trial became a media sensation, drawing the attention of the public and shining an uncomfortable spotlight on his empire. The prosecution worked tirelessly to present a case against him, and the case quickly turned into a spectacle, with witnesses testifying about Luciano's role in various criminal enterprises. The trial was a powerful reminder of the dangers of operating in such a public way, and it underscored the fact that even the most powerful mafia bosses could be brought down by a determined legal system. Luciano's fate was sealed when he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. However, even in prison his influence did not wane. Luciano was no stranger to the power dynamics of the criminal world, and he quickly realized that his time in prison didn't mean the end of his control over the mafia. In fact, it only reinforced the idea that the mafia's operations could continue to run smoothly even without its leader physically present. This paradox, Luciano behind bars but still pulling the strings of his empire, became a key aspect of his legacy. It was a testament to his strategic brilliance that even when confined to a prison cell, he remained a central figure in the mafia's global operations. From his prison cell, Luciano continued to manage the mafia, relying on a network of loyal allies and trusted subordinates to carry out his will. His ability to maintain control while incarcerated was due in large part to the systems he had established over the years. The commission he had created ensured that the different mafia families were organized and that their actions were coordinated. This organizational structure allowed Luciano's empire to function as a well-oiled machine, even in his absence. While others might have struggled to maintain power in a similar situation, Luciano's foresight and planning allowed the mafia to continue expanding and operating as a cohesive unit. It was during this time in prison that Luciano's influence began to reach even further. The war effort in World War II provided an opportunity for Luciano to solidify his position. In 1942, as the United States entered the war, the government, in desperate need of assistance, struck a deal with Luciano. The U.S. Navy, which was involved in operations on the East Coast, had concerns about sabotage and other criminal activity that could potentially disrupt military operations. The government turned to Luciano, knowing that his influence in the port areas would make him a valuable ally. In exchange for his help in securing the docks and preventing sabotage, the government promised to commute his sentence. Luciano's agreement with the U.S. government marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. By cooperating with the authorities, he not only earned his release but also gained further leverage in the underworld. The deal demonstrated his unparalleled ability to navigate the most complex political and criminal landscapes. While some viewed his cooperation with the government as a betrayal, Luciano saw it as a strategic move that would allow him to regain his freedom and continue to exert control over the mafia. His time in prison had not weakened his position. It had only cemented his status as a key player in both the criminal and political arenas. Luciano's release from prison in 1946 was a momentous event in the world of organized crime. The deal with the U.S. government allowed him to return to Italy, where he lived for the remainder of his life. However, his power, though diminished, was not entirely gone. Luciano continued to exert influence over the mafia, albeit from afar. His legacy as the man who transformed the mafia into a more organized, business-like entity was secure. Even in exile, Luciano remained one of the most important figures in the history of organized crime, a symbol of the mafia's enduring power and resilience. Though Luciano's time in power was marked by constant challenges, both from within and outside the mafia, his ability to survive, adapt, and even thrive in the face of adversity became a defining characteristic of his reign. He not only survived law enforcement's best efforts to dismantle his empire but managed to turn those challenges into opportunities for growth and expansion. His legacy, both in the mafia and in the world of organized crime, is one of enduring influence, strategic brilliance, and an unyielding drive for power that transcended even the prison walls. Despite his eventual fall, the principles he established, organization, loyalty, and strategic alliances, would become the foundation upon which future generations of mobsters would build their own criminal empires. Luciano's downfall, though seemingly inevitable given the structure of organized crime and the growing pressure from law enforcement, was not the dramatic, violent collapse of the mafia empire that many might have anticipated. Instead, it was a gradual unraveling, a slow erosion of the foundation he had meticulously built. His eventual arrest and the subsequent trial were not just the loss of his physical freedom but represented the beginning of a new chapter, one that would transform the mafia, its leaders, and its future. Despite his initial rise to power being built on ruthlessness and cunning, It was his calculated approach to control and governance that allowed him to survive as long as he did. However, in the face of mounting legal pressure, he found himself in the crosshairs of the law, and the weight of his past misdeeds finally caught up with him. Luciano's arrest in 1936 was a critical moment in the story of his life, but it was not the final blow. At the time, he had reached the pinnacle of his power, controlling vast criminal enterprises not just in New York but throughout the United States. He had reshaped the Mafia from a fragmented network of rival families into a highly organized, centralized business empire that could rival legitimate corporations. His influence stretched from the streets of New York to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., where he had cultivated relationships with key political figures and law enforcement officers. However, despite this vast network, the authorities had successfully charged him with running a massive prostitution ring, a crime that carried severe penalties. Luciano's world, built on a mix of violence, loyalty, and strategic alliances, seemed impenetrable, but the law had finally found its way inside. The trial that followed was a spectacle, not just for the public but for the criminal world. The evidence against Luciano was compelling. His empire had been built on a foundation of illegal activities that spanned the entire criminal spectrum. While he was primarily known for his control of the prostitution industry, his operations also included extortion, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and a web of other illicit businesses. The prosecution painted him as the kingpin of a sprawling criminal syndicate, someone who had masterminded a system of exploitation and violence that affected every corner of society. The trial was the beginning of a shift in public perception, not just of Luciano but of organized crime as a whole. The government, buoyed by the media frenzy, saw this trial as an opportunity to send a message. Even the most powerful criminals were not above the law. At the heart of the trial was the realization that Luciano's rise to power was not the work of a lone criminal mastermind, but rather the result of his ability to control and manipulate an entire system. He was not simply a mob boss, but a central figure in an organized criminal enterprise that spanned entire industries, connected politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officers who benefited from the arrangement. Luciano had turned the Mafia into a highly efficient, profitable business, and now the government was intent on taking that down. The trial represented the culmination of years of efforts to dismantle the power of organized crime in America, and Luciano stood at the center of that storm. Despite the legal storm swirling around him, Luciano remained calm and composed. He had been through worse before, surviving the violent years of the Castellamarese War, navigating the treacherous world of Mafia politics, and managing an empire that operated at the highest levels of secrecy. He understood that the court of public opinion was just as important as any courtroom. However, even his legendary ability to keep a low profile and avoid direct confrontation with the authorities could not save him from the charges that were mounting against him. His conviction, which resulted in a 30 to 50-year sentence, was a clear signal from the government that they would no longer tolerate the Mafia's unchecked power. However, the story of Luciano's fall was not finished. In fact, it was just beginning. In prison, Luciano's power did not wane, it simply shifted form. He had spent years building an empire that was not dependent on his physical presence. The commission he had created, along with the network of loyal allies he had cultivated, ensured that the Mafia continued to function efficiently, even without its leader at the helm. His men, people like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, were more than capable of continuing Luciano's work. In fact, the structure of the Mafia that Luciano had put in place made it nearly impossible for any single individual to take over completely. Instead, power was distributed across different factions, all of which answered to Luciano, even from behind bars. In prison, Luciano faced not just the reality of his conviction but also the new challenges of being a criminal mastermind with limited physical freedom. However, his connections and influence remained intact. The political power he had cultivated over the years proved to be invaluable. He had spent time building relationships with key figures in the U.S. government, including law enforcement and political figures who owed him favors or shared interests. In fact, his imprisonment became an opportunity for the U.S. government to capitalize on his connections, particularly during the Second World War. With the country facing unprecedented challenges, including the threat of sabotage from Axis powers, Luciano became a key asset to the government. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano was promised certain privileges, including the possibility of his release. He had long understood the value of pragmatic alliances, and his agreement to help secure the ports in New York and prevent sabotage during the war was a testament to his strategic thinking. Luciano's ability to turn his imprisonment into an advantage demonstrated his unrivaled skill in navigating complex political landscapes. By providing the government with his assistance, Luciano ensured that his release was not just a personal victory, but one that secured his continued relevance in the world of organized crime. His role in World War II marked an unusual chapter in Luciano's life, a chapter where he went from being a fugitive from the law to a partner with the government. His cooperation with the U.S. Navy to secure the docks and prevent sabotage allowed him to maintain some influence over the city, even while behind bars. While others might have seen his cooperation as a betrayal, Luciano viewed it as a calculated move to ensure his survival. It was during this time that his connections and power truly became evident. He had forged ties with powerful figures in the government, and those ties proved to be the key to his eventual release. In 1946, Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy. This marked the final chapter of his story in the United States. The government, having extracted what they needed from him, no longer had a reason to keep him in the country. His release, however, did not mark the end of his influence. Despite being exiled to a foreign country, Luciano's reach extended far beyond the borders of Italy. His connections in the United States remained intact, and his ability to influence the Mafia was still strong, even if he was no longer physically present. His return to Italy, while not a triumphant homecoming, allowed him to retain his place in the world of organized crime. However, Luciano's years in exile were marked by a sense of reflection and philosophical change. As he aged, he began to realize that his time at the top of the Mafia was drawing to a close. The world had changed and so had the Mafia. The years of violent conflict, political maneuvering, and criminal enterprise had taken their toll. The system Luciano had built was no longer sustainable in the same way it had been when he first created it. The world was evolving, and Luciano, ever the pragmatist, began to reconsider his position within it. His final years were spent in relative quiet, though still under the shadow of his legacy. He had lived a life defined by power, loyalty, and betrayal, but in the end, it was clear that even the most formidable criminal empire had its limits. Luciano's story was one of survival, not just of his body but of his influence. Despite his eventual fall from grace, his legacy was not easily erased. The systems he had put in place continued to shape the Mafia for decades, and his approach to organized crime became the blueprint for future generations of mobsters. Luciano's downfall, then, was not just a result of his imprisonment but a natural progression of the changing dynamics of crime and society. His ability to survive despite these challenges was a testament to his genius, but the ultimate lesson from his life is that even the most powerful figures in organized crime cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. His rise, reign, and fall stand as a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the inevitability of decline. But even in his decline, Luciano managed to retain the respect and fear of those around him, ensuring that his legacy would live on in the annals of Mafia history. Luciano's trial and subsequent sentence marked the culmination of years of rising power, but the courtroom drama also revealed the seismic shift in both the Mafia's operation and the state's relentless pursuit of justice. The media frenzy surrounding his conviction amplified the public perception of organized crime, turning it into a national spectacle. Yet, within the walls of the courtroom, Luciano was not just a criminal on trial. He became the symbol of a criminal enterprise that had, for decades, thrived in the shadows. His fate would set a precedent, shaping the future of both law enforcement tactics and the Mafia's struggle for survival in a new era of increased public scrutiny. The trial itself was a complex affair, lasting for months, and it wasn't just about proving Luciano's involvement in the prostitution ring that had led to his arrest. It was also about painting a picture of the Mafia as a sprawling, sophisticated criminal operation that reached into every facet of American society. The prosecution, fueled by the growing realization that the Mafia could no longer operate with impunity, focused not only on Luciano's personal actions but on the larger infrastructure of his criminal empire. The case presented to the court was a clear portrayal of a system of rackets, coercion, and organized violence, a far cry from the small-time disorganized crime of the past. At the heart of the trial was the portrayal of Luciano as a cold, calculating mastermind, someone who had orchestrated a network of illicit activities designed not just to profit but to entrench himself and his allies at the very top of American society. It was a brilliant strategy. The prosecution painted Luciano as a puppet master, a man who manipulated and controlled the lives of thousands, from corrupt politicians to working-class men caught in the snare of his illegal enterprises. His control over the vice trade, bootlegging, labor unions, and other sectors of the criminal economy showed a man who had transcended the typical mobster archetype. He was no longer just a street thug. He was a corporate criminal, a businessman operating in the shadows. Luciano's defense, on the other hand, was just as strategic. He was no fool. He understood that his reputation and his very survival depended on how he was perceived. His lawyers did not deny his involvement in crime but attempted to reframe it. They argued that Luciano had been misunderstood, that he was merely a product of his environment, a man who had risen from the streets to create something that, for all its criminality, provided a sense of order and control to an otherwise chaotic world. It was a clever attempt to humanize him, to cast him as a man who had risen through the ranks not by pure violence, but by building something larger than himself. They portrayed him as a necessary figure in a world rife with corruption and crime, where law enforcement was as corrupt as the criminals they pursued. Despite the best efforts of his defense team, the weight of the evidence against Luciano was overwhelming. His conviction sent shockwaves through the Mafia. For the first time, a figure of his stature was brought to justice, and it felt as though the walls that had long protected the Mafia were finally beginning to crumble. His sentence of 30 to 50 years in prison seemed like a fitting punishment for someone who had so expertly evaded justice for so long. But for Luciano, the sentence wasn't just a loss of personal freedom, it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between law enforcement and the criminal underworld.